What German generals said when Patton wouldn't stop, August 1st, 1944. The French countryside near Avranches, German commanders across France received reports that sent chills down their spines. Not because of what they saw, but because of what they couldn't see. General George S. Patton's Third Army had just become operational. And within days, everything the Germans thought they knew about warfare was about to be challenged. Welcome to today's deep dive into one of World War II's most fascinating military dynamics. This isn't just another Patton story, this is about what happened when an unstoppable force met a crumbling defence, and what the German generals really said when they realised Patton wouldn't stop. You see, popular culture has given us a simple narrative. The Germans feared Patton above all others, but the truth? It's far more complex, far more interesting, and reveals both the genius and the mythology surrounding one of America's most controversial generals. Today, we're going to explore 3 critical campaigns where German commanders faced Patton's relentless advance: the breakout from Normandy, the tank battle at Arracourt, and the legendary relief of Bastogne. And most importantly, we'll hear what German generals actually said, both during the war and after. The Normandy breakout. Let's begin with a surprising fact. For most of 1943 and early 1944, German military records show virtually no mention of George Patton. During his campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, Wehrmacht commanders barely took notice of him. But that was about to change. The setup. By late July 1944, the Allies had been stuck in Normandy for nearly 2 months. The thick Norman hedgerows and determined German resistance had turned what should have been a breakthrough into a grinding stalemate. Each hedgerow was a natural fortress, each field a killing zone. Then came Operation Cobra. On July 25th, American forces launched a devastating aerial bombardment, dropping nearly 5,000 tons of bombs on German positions. Through the gap created by this assault, General Omar Bradley's forces began pushing south. But Bradley needed someone special to exploit this breakthrough, someone aggressive, someone who wouldn't stop. He chose Patton. Patton's philosophy. On August 1st, 1944, Patton's Third Army became operational. But Patton had already been in action, taking operational control several days earlier. And he had a simple order for his commanders: go east and go like hell. But Patton's approach was revolutionary for its time. While other commanders worried about securing territory, Patton had a different priority. In his own words, "We are advancing constantly, and we are not interested in holding on to anything except the enemy. Let the Germans worry about holding ground." Patton was interested in speed, shock, and chaos. The breakthrough. Between August 1st and 4th, 7 divisions of Patton's Third Army swept through Avranches and over the Narrow, bridge at Pont-au-Beau into Brittany. It was a logistical nightmare that Patton turned into a masterpiece of maneuver warfare. His forces moved so fast that normal tactics couldn't keep up. Artillery spotters in light aircraft were pressed into reconnaissance roles. Division commanders like Major General John Wood of the 4th Armoured Division had his aerial observer, the legendary Bazooka Charlie Carpenter, fly ahead to personally deliver orders because radio communications couldn't keep pace. Some divisions advanced up to 40 miles in a single day, a pace that seemed impossible given the terrain and German resistance. The German response. Now here's where it gets interesting. How did the Germans respond? Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding German forces in the West, faced an impossible situation. The Wehrmacht had been devastated by 2 months of attritional fighting in Normandy. They had no reserves. The Soviet summer offensive, Operation Bagration, had destroyed Army Group Center on the Eastern Front, so no reinforcements were coming from the east. And now Patton was racing through France. Von Kluge assembled what he could, 8 of the 9 panzer divisions in Normandy, but only 4 could be pulled from their defensive positions in time. With these understrength, exhausted units, he was ordered by Hitler himself to launch a counterattack. Operation Lüttich. On August 7th, the Germans launched Operation Lüttich, attempting to cut through to the coast at Avranches and trap Patton's forces. Hitler believed this could annihilate the American advance. It was a disaster. American forces, warned by ultra-intelligence intercepts, were ready. The German attack stalled almost immediately. Making matters worse, the attack exposed German panzer divisions to devastating Allied air power once the weather cleared. The very forces meant to stop Patton ended up being trapped themselves in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. The chase. With the German counterattack shattered, Patton did what he did best. He pursued relentlessly. His forces swept east across France, liberating town after town. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, having been pulled back to England to prepare for new airborne operations, found themselves repeatedly grounded because Patton kept overrunning their planned drop zones before they could even board their planes. Think about that. Patton was moving so fast he was outrunning airborne assault plans. By August 25th, elements of Patton's Third Army reached the outskirts of Paris. 5 days later, Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, was declared complete. In less than a month, Patton's Third Army had swept 400 miles across France. What the Germans said. During the battle. Here's the critical point. During this campaign, German commanders were too busy trying to survive to form opinions about Patton. Their records from August 1944 speak of desperation, confusion, and the overwhelming shock of American mobile warfare. One thing became clear to every German commander in France. The war in the West had fundamentally changed. The static defense that had worked in Normandy was useless against Patton's style of warfare. The Battle of Arracourt. September 1944. Patton's Third Army had crossed the Moselle River in northeastern France, entering the Lorraine region. The German frontier was within striking distance. If Patton could maintain his momentum, his tanks might reach the Rhine before winter. But then two things happened. Patton ran out of fuel and the Germans decided to stop him. The setup. By September, Allied logistics had become a critical problem. The rapid advance across France had outrun supply lines. Fuel, ammunition, and other supplies had to be trucked hundreds of miles from Normandy beaches. To make matters worse, Supreme Commander Eisenhower had prioritized supplies for British Field Marshal Montgomery's Operation Market Garden in the north. Patton was furious. He was told to go on the defensive. But Patton being Patton, he interpreted defensive rather creatively. Near the small French town of Arracourt, Patton's 5th Corps, spearheaded by the 4th Armoured Division, held a bridgehead across the Moselle. It was a vulnerable salient, a bulge in the American lines that the Germans believed they could cut off and destroy. The German counterattack. The German High Command saw their opportunity. They assembled two newly formed panzer brigades, the 111th and 113th, equipped with the latest Panther tanks and Panzer I-4s. Additionally, they committed elements of the experienced 11th Panzer Division. In total, 262 tanks and assault guns. These forces were placed under the command of General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army. Their orders? Destroy the American bridgehead at Arracourt and throw the Americans back across the Moselle. On paper, it looked like the Germans had the advantage. The Panther's 75mm gun could destroy a Sherman tank from 2,000 meters. The Sherman's 75mm gun struggled to penetrate a Panther's frontal armor even at point-blank range. The Germans had local superiority in numbers. Dramatic pause. They were about to learn that technology isn't everything. The battle. September 19th, 1944. Early morning fog blanketed the rolling hills around Arracourt. Perfect conditions for an attack, or so the Germans thought. The German panzer brigades rolled forward, expecting to overwhelm the thinly held American positions. But they made critical mistakes. First, inadequate reconnaissance. The Germans didn't know where the American forces actually were. Second, poor tactical deployment. The panzer units advanced in poorly coordinated attacks, often exposing their thinner side armor. Third, they underestimated American artillery. The Americans had positioned their forces on favorable terrain with excellent fields of fire and pre-registered artillery positions. When the German tanks emerged from the fog, they found themselves facing not just Sherman tanks, but a fully coordinated combined arms defense. American tank destroyers, artillery and tactical aircraft all worked in perfect synchronization. The fog that the Germans thought would protect them actually worked against them. It neutralized their superior long-range guns, while American forces used it as cover to flank the German formations. The result? A slaughter. The numbers. The battle raged for 11 days, from September 18th to 29th. By the end, German losses: 262 tanks and assault guns committed, 86 destroyed outright, 114 damaged or broken down, only 62 operational at the end. American losses: Combat Command. A of the 4th Armoured, which bore the brunt of the fighting, lost 25 tanks and 7 tank destroyers. The entire 4th Armoured Division lost about 48 tanks for the month of September. The Germans lost over 200 armoured vehicles. The Americans lost fewer than 50. Additionally, German casualties included approximately 3,000 killed and another 3,000 captured. The 2 panzer brigades that Hitler had counted on to stop Patton were rendered combat ineffective. What made the difference? It wasn't technology. It was training, tactics, communication, and leadership. American tank crews were better trained. They worked seamlessly with infantry, artillery, and air support. Their maintenance crews kept vehicles running. Their supply lines, despite being stretched, still delivered ammunition when needed. But perhaps most importantly, initiative and adaptability. American commanders at every level, from battalion to company to platoon, were trained to make decisions quickly and exploit opportunities. German forces, by contrast, often waited for orders that came too late or not at all. Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion and later Army Chief of Staff during the Vietnam War, exemplified this American approach. His unit's aggressive tactics and quick decision-making repeatedly caught German forces off balance. What the Germans said. Arracourt. Here's the fascinating paradox of Arracourt. Despite their devastating losses, German commanders believed they had succeeded. General Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, Chief of Staff of the 5th Panzer Army, later wrote, "Quite apart from Hitler's orders, our attacks on the 85th Corps at Arracourt appeared to have some justification. When Balck took over Army Group G on 21st September, it looked as though the Americans were determined to force their way through to the Saar and the Rhine, and General Patton might well have done so if he had been given a free hand." Von Mellenthin continued, "At that time the West Wall was still unmanned, and no effective defence could have been made there. From our point of view, there was much to be said for counter-attacking the spearheads of the 25th Corps to discourage the Americans from advancing farther." In other words, they achieved their strategic objective. Patton had stopped advancing. They didn't realise, or didn't want to admit, that it wasn't their counterattack that stopped him. It was his lack of fuel and Eisenhower's orders. The German attacks at Arracourt didn't stop Patton. Logistics and Allied command decisions did, but the Germans needed to believe their sacrifice had meaning. The Battle of the Bulge. December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Hitler launched his final major offensive on the Western Front, a massive surprise attack designed to split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. It was Germany's last roll of the dice, and one German general knew exactly who would respond. The German plan and fears. General Erich Brandenberger commanded the German 7th Army, tasked with protecting the southern flank of the offensive. While other German commanders assumed the Americans would counterattack at the tip of the Bulge, Brandenberger knew better. He later wrote, "7th Army was firmly convinced that the German operation would evoke a speedy reaction from the enemy. Since it was highly probable that the Franco-Belgian area contained no large reserve, the possibility had to be considered that all available enemy troops in the area of Metz, and perhaps also in the sector opposite Army Group G, would be brought up for offensive action against the southern flank of the attacking German armies." Translation: Brandenberger expected Patton to attack from the south, fast, but even Brandenberger, who understood Patton better than most, underestimated him. He assumed it would take at least 4 days for Patton to wheel his entire Third Army from its positions in eastern France northward to Belgium. He was wrong. The Versailles Conference. December 19th, 1944. Supreme Headquarters at Versailles. Eisenhower called an emergency conference of his top commanders. The situation was dire. German forces had achieved complete surprise and were driving deep into American lines. Eisenhower asked the crucial question: how quickly could Patton turn the Third Army north to counterattack? Patton's response shocked everyone in the room. I can attack with 2 divisions within 48 hours and with 3 divisions within 72 hours. The other generals thought he was being overly optimistic, perhaps even reckless. What they didn't know was that Patton had already anticipated this possibility. Before leaving for the conference, he had ordered his staff to prepare 3 contingency plans for exactly this scenario. When Eisenhower asked the question, the movement was already beginning. The impossible maneuver. What Patton proposed was considered logistically impossible. He needed to disengage 3 full divisions from active combat in eastern France, rotate his entire Third Army 90 degrees to the north, move more than 100,000 men with thousands of vehicles, 125 miles through winter conditions. Do all of this in the middle of winter, over roads buried in snow, ice, and mud. Maintain communications by laying nearly 20,000 miles of new wire. Organize all of this in less than 48 hours, and then, instead of arriving exhausted and disorganized, be ready to immediately attack some of the best remaining units in the German army. He did it. The race to Bastogne. The Belgian town of Bastogne was critical. All 7 major roads in the Ardennes region converged there. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the region. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded and outnumbered, held Bastogne against repeated German assaults. On December 22nd, German commanders sent an ultimatum demanding honourable surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's response became legendary. Nuts! The 101st would hold, but they were running out of ammunition, medical supplies and time. They needed relief. They needed Patton. The breakthrough. Patton's forces began their attack on December 22nd, just 3 days after the Versailles Conference. The 4th Armoured Division, the same unit that had destroyed German panzers at Arracourt, spearheaded the assault. The German forces on the southern flank fought desperately. The 5th Fallschirmjäger Division and other units were ordered to stop Patton at all costs. They knew what was coming, but nothing could stop the Third Army's momentum. Through brutal winter conditions, against determined resistance, often fighting in sub-zero temperatures through snowdrifts, Patton's forces pushed northward. On December 26th, just 10 days after the German offensive began, and only 7 days after the Versailles Conference, elements of the 4th Armoured Division broke through to Bastogne. The siege was lifted. Patton's assessment. After the battle, Patton wrote, "During the operation, the Third Army moved farther and faster and engaged more divisions in less time than any other army in the history of the United States, possibly the history of the world." For once, this wasn't Patton's typical bombast. It was accurate. The manoeuvre to relieve Bastogne required moving over 250,000 men and 133,000 vehicles, more than 100 miles through winter conditions, then immediately engaging in offensive operations. The Third Army fought 18 German divisions and inflicted over 100,000 casualties, while suffering approximately 50,000 casualties of its own. What the Germans said. Bulge, General Brandenberger, who had predicted Patton's counterattack, was nevertheless shocked by its speed. The German commanders on the southern flank found themselves overwhelmed not just by American firepower, but by the tempo of operations. German after-action reports from the Bulge repeatedly mention the aggressive American armoured forces on the southern flank. But more telling are the operational decisions. By December 26th, German commanders realised the offensive had failed. Patton's relief of Bastogne broke the back of Hitler's last gamble in the West. What they really said. So what did German generals really say about Patton? The answer reveals both admiration and mythology. After the war, the compliments. After Germany's defeat, Allied interrogators asked German generals about their American adversaries. Some of their responses about Patton have become famous. General Günther Blumentritt, who helped plan the invasions of France and Poland, wrote, "We regarded General Patton extremely highly as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a man of incredible initiative and lightning-like action. His operations impressed us enormously, probably because he came closest to our own concept of the classical military commander." Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations throughout the war, told interrogators, He was the American Guderian. He was very bold and preferred large movements. He took big risks and won big successes. General Heinz Guderian himself, the father of German panzer tactics, said, "From the standpoint of a tank specialist, I must congratulate him for his victory since he acted as I should have done had I been in his position." These are powerful endorsements from Germany's top commanders. The reality check. But here's the critical context. These comments were made after the war, during Allied interrogations. They weren't battlefield assessments made during active operations. Moreover, research into surviving German military records reveals something surprising. The Germans paid virtually no attention to Patton until his August 1944 breakthrough in Normandy. During his North African and Sicilian campaigns, German intelligence reports at the theatre, army and division levels barely mentioned him. Even during his campaigns in France, German commanders viewed Patton narrowly. They saw him as a skilled tactical commander and executor of others' plans, but not necessarily as a strategic mastermind. Some German reports from Sicily noted that his movements were systematic and predictable, giving them time to consolidate dangerous situations. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, when asked to compare Allied commanders, called both Montgomery and Patton excellent, but for different reasons. Blumentritt, summarizing von Rundstedt's views, noted that Patton was more daring but that Montgomery never suffered a reverse because of his methodical approach. The truth. So what's the truth? Patton was genuinely respected by German commanders for his aggressive armoured warfare tactics. His speed, audacity and ability to maintain offensive momentum impressed them because it mirrored their own panzer tactics, the very tactics that had brought them such success early in the war. But the myth that Patton was the most feared Allied general, constantly watched and worried about by the German High Command, is largely post-war embellishment. For most of the war, they were far more concerned about Montgomery in the north, about Allied air supremacy, and about the Soviet steamroller in the east. What made Patton dangerous wasn't that the Germans feared him above all others. It was that his tactical approach, combined with American material superiority, excellent logistics, and increasingly skilled troops, represented a style of warfare the depleted German forces couldn't counter. The story of Patton and the German generals isn't really about fear. It's about respect. Grudging, professional respect from one group of warriors to another. The German generals recognized in Patton something familiar, a commander who understood that in armoured warfare, speed and aggression often matter more than firepower. A leader who believed that movement and shock could paralyze an enemy more effectively than methodical advance. They saw in him a reflection of their own panzer philosophy, turned against them with the overwhelming industrial and material might of America behind it. When German generals said Patton wouldn't stop, they weren't expressing fear, they were acknowledging a fundamental shift in the war. The blitzkrieg tactics that Germany had pioneered were now being used against them by an opponent with unlimited resources. Patton's Third Army captured over 80,000 square miles of territory, took more than 1.8 million German prisoners, and was in continuous combat for 281 days. Whether the German High Command spent their nights worrying specifically about Patton or not, one thing is undeniable. Once Patton started rolling across France, nothing could stop him. Not the weather, not supply shortages, not the best panzer divisions Germany could field. And in the end, perhaps that's what mattered most. Not what the German generals said about Patton, but what they couldn't do to stop him. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the real story behind Patton and the German generals, please like, subscribe and share. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on Patton's leadership style and whether you think he deserves his legendary reputation. Until next time, remember, history is always more complex than the legends we tell about it.